How does one of America's, well, one of its richest, most famous cities end up slashing its emergency budget? And then just a few months down the line, find itself just overwhelmed by fire, staring down a financial crisis, and dealing with, frankly, chaos.
Welcome to the deep dive. Our mission today is really to get under the hood, look at the source materials around the administration of Los Angeles Mayor Karen Bass. We're going to unpack the specific money decisions, her stated policy goals, and the results. The results that have drawn so much fire from critics and in news reports.
Yeah, and we really have to start with that shocking timeline, the one that kind of kicked off this whole deep dive for us. Early 2025, you have Los Angeles County just hammered by these huge wildfires. The Palisades Fire, for instance, burned something like 25,000 acres in barely 24 hours. I mean, just immediate, massive destruction.
And what makes it so stark is the timing. This huge disaster hits maybe 6 months after the city, with Mayor Bass in charge, finalizes this budget. And that budget included significant cuts to the Los Angeles Fire Department, the LAFD. It just set up this immediate, very jarring clash between, the city's planning and the reality on the ground.
The numbers are really specific here, too. The city controller reported the LAFD budget was cut by $17.6 million for fiscal year 2025. That was actually the second biggest department cut they made, right?
Mm-hmm.
Only street services got hit harder.
That's the official figure, yes. And some other sources we looked at suggested the actual year-on-year reduction in terms of operations might have been closer to $30 million. So a substantial amount either way.
And then the fires hit. And you see the impact almost immediately in the reports, don't you?
You really do. We found accounts from LAFD firefighters speaking out pretty bluntly, actually. One told the press, and I'm quoting here, "Staffing and budget cuts doesn't allow to plan and prepare and pre-deploy as we should have."
Doesn't allow them to prepare.
Exactly. And another account mentioned crews being held back in certain areas. Why? Because there weren't enough available fire engines ready to go.
That's just horrifying to hear. I read one quote from a longtime resident there in Pacific Palisades who basically just said, no one came to help. Which brings us right to the core question for this deep dive. Why make those cuts? Where did the money go instead? And how did this whole situation spiral so fast that you actually had an official committee forming to recall the mayor in early 2025?
Well, the sources suggest these problems are all kind of tangled together. It's not just about the LAFD cuts. The city seems to be struggling across the board: public safety, quality of life, even its own financial health. And the critics, they argue the crises are basically the fallout from mismanaged money and maybe fuzzy priorities.
Let's look at the mayor's response right when this was happening. When she was asked about the fire department cuts, while the fires were still burning, her defense drew a lot of criticism. What exactly did she say?
She was pretty clear. She stated the reductions were no reductions that would have impacted the situation. And she blamed, quote, tough budgetary times.
So a denial that had any impact.
A direct denial. And that denial, coupled with the chaos people were seeing, seems to be a major spark for that formal recall effort. It kicked off almost right after the fires were finally contained.
But that denial just flies in the face of what her own firefighters were saying, right? The people actually on the ground.
It does seem to contradict their accounts, yeah.
So, okay, if we follow the money, where did those resources that didn't go to LAFD end up? What were the results there?
Well, that trail leads pretty directly to the city's big initiative, the one meant to tackle the homelessness crisis. It's a program called Inside Safe. And this is where the sources highlight a really, let's say, difficult cost versus results picture.
Extremely difficult. The sources we reviewed said that even after spending $67 million on Inside Safe, as of April 2024, they'd only moved 255 people into permanent housing out of, what was the estimated homeless population? Something like 46,000?
Around 46,000 in the city proper, yes. So you do the math. That's an incredibly high cost for each permanent placement achieved so far.
And the overall problem isn't getting better.
No, actually, the sources show homelessness numbers in LA have gone up by about 10% since Mayor Bass took office. So the trend is going the wrong way, despite the spending.
And even for the people they did move indoors, temporarily usually, the results seem pretty shaky. The tracking data for Inside Safe, again as of April 2024, showed that out of about 2,600 people moved indoors.
Right, temporarily moved indoors.
Temporarily, yeah. Over 613 actually went back to being homeless. Another 42 ended up incarcerated. And sadly, 38 people died while they were in the program.
It really paints a picture of a revolving door, doesn't it? The strategy seems to rely heavily on temporary hotel stays, but the sources suggest it's maybe lacking the deep mental health support or job placement needed to make it stick long term.
That's what the critics argue, definitely, that the approach is flawed, lacks real accountability. And it got so difficult that the mayor eventually tried to, well, shift the burden, didn't she? Asking wealthy residents to fund this LA4LA thing to buy buildings.
That's right, an initiative called LA4LA, and critics jumped on that immediately, calling it a bad game plan.
You can see why. The city spends millions on its own program, it doesn't seem to be working that well, and then asks private citizens who are already paying pretty high taxes, mind you, to basically bail the system out.
It does send a signal, perhaps, about the city's confidence in its own financial management.
And that lack of confidence, that financial distress, it connects right back to why those LAFD cuts might have happened in the first place, right? The city wasn't just trimming fat. Sources say LA is facing a massive budget deficit.
Massive is the word. We're talking nearly $1 billion.
$1 billion. For a city like Los Angeles with its tax base, that's staggering. What's driving that kind of shortfall? Is there one main thing?
According to the city administrator's reports, yeah, there is. The biggest driver, by far, is liability claims and lawsuits against the city. They've just blown past the budgeted amount.
How much over budget are we talking?
Well, for the 2025 fiscal year, they budgeted about $100 million for these claims, but the projection is they'll likely spend closer to $320 million. That's, what, a 220% overrun? Just on lawsuits and claims.
Wow. What kind of claims are we talking about? What's costing so much?
It's a whole range of things based on the reports. Big payouts related to police misconduct, excessive force lawsuits, definitely, but also things like infrastructure failures, discrimination claims. It adds up. And every single dollar paid out for these comes straight from the city's general fund.
Meaning it had to be taken from somewhere else.
Exactly. Taken from services like the LAFD, like street cleaning, like parks.
And the consequences now are pretty severe.
Very. The sources confirm the city had to dip into its reserve fund, pulling it below the minimum 5% level they're supposed to maintain. That's a serious red flag. They're looking at potentially over 1,600 layoffs, consolidating departments.
And borrowing money, too.
Yeah, potentially needing to borrow at least $80 million just to cover the current liability payouts, which, of course, costs money itself, maybe up to $20 million just in interest payments.
There was that quote from Councilmember Yaroslavsky that summed it up pretty well, wasn't there?
Yes, she said, every dollar that we spend on lawsuits is a dollar that we're not spending on making our neighborhoods safer. It really captures that direct trade-off. This financial mess is, you could argue, the result of past failures kind of catching up with the present budget.
Okay, so the city's drowning in these lawsuit costs. Basic services like fire protection are getting squeezed. It forces that really critical question. Where did the available money get prioritized? If not firefighters, then what? What do the critics say?
And this is where that ideological critique, which is present in some of the source material, comes into focus. Some critics explicitly claim Mayor Bass defunded firefighters to fund NGOs, non-governmental organizations.
NGOs, and the claim goes further, right?
Yes, the specific contention we found in some reports was that money got redirected to, quote, homeless NGO who are fighting for the rights of illegal immigrants.
We have to be precise about the language in the sources here.
Yeah.
One critic we read described NGOs as, quote, code for leftist activists most times. The argument being that funds are going to politically aligned groups instead of, core city functions.
And this idea, this alleged redirection of money towards activist groups rather than basic city services, that's where the sources start to connect current policies to the mayor's, well, her controversial political history. Critics argue that history helps explain these priorities.
Right. The sources detail her involvement back in the 1970s with the Venceremos Brigade. She attended, 8 times? While Castro was in power in Cuba.
8 times, according to the reports. And critics define the Venceremos Brigade pretty sharply. They call it a Marxist training program, directly linked to Castro's regime. Some sources claim Castro set it up to recruit young American leftists, using humanitarian work as a cover, but with underlying goals related to intelligence gathering and insurgency training. It was called a radical Marxist group used by Cuban intelligence.
And it wasn't just a youthful thing, apparently. When Fidel Castro died more recently, Mayor Bass publicly praised him, calling his death a great loss to the people of Cuba.
That praise, combined with the brigade history, well, according to the sources, that whole background was considered toxic enough, too heavy, that it became a real sticking point when she was vetted as a possible vice president pick for Joe Biden.
And critics draw a line, a direct line, they say, from that background, that sort of veneration of radical figures, to the way the city is being run now. The argument is, when you prioritize ideology over just effective management.
You end up with the kind of situation described in some reports about downtown LA. One source called it a dystopian nightmare.
Yeah, that same source described it as just widespread misery and decadence. And the economic numbers seem to back up the decline. Commercial vacancy rates downtown are apparently now higher than Detroit's, according to one firm. The critics basically conclude that these specific policies, prioritizing activism over administration, are what led to what they call the miserable death of downtown Los Angeles.
So look, if we pull all this together for you, the evidence laid out in the sources suggests a pattern. A major American city cuts emergency services, then faces a disaster. It spends $67 million on a homelessness program, yet the problem gets worse, up 10%. And now it's facing, potentially, a billion-dollar financial hole, largely driven by lawsuits. The argument presented in the sources is that these aren't just random failures, but the predictable result of putting a certain political philosophy ahead of basic city governance.
Which leaves us, and you, with this final thought. The sources confirm that recall effort against Mayor Bass. It didn't get enough signatures to make the ballot. So the situation continues. And the question becomes, if a city as prominent as Los Angeles cuts essential services like fire protection, racks up nearly $1 billion in deficits, sees homelessness rise after trying this different approach, how much more does it take? How much more chaos before the citizens there, or maybe the rest of us watching, start to think harder about how much effective, non-ideological governance really matters and maybe demand a different course? That's something for you to think about.